Hello, I'm Evan Flocker and welcome to this podcast on giving feedback or helping people do their best. Something to consider that according to a number of major polling organisations, around about £180 billion is lost every year due to disengaged and demotivated employees. Now, when we think that nearly half of all staff at most organisations in UK are dissatisfied at work, there's some significant costs to consider. A fundamental element of motivating people is if and how we give people feedback. So we have an opportunity to reduce the costs on our organisations by giving good feedback. So I have a question for you. Have a think, pause the podcast and write down the answer. When you receive feedback, does it tell you what you're doing right, what you need to do differently, or both? If the answer that you've written down is not C, then the feedback that you're receiving is likely to be ineffective. So let's explore this a little bit more. So the objectives for this podcast are for you to be able to define what constructive feedback is and to be able to demonstrate feedback skills that result in a positive change in the person receiving that feedback. The agenda for this podcast is we're going to have a look at why, constructive feedback, the ask-give model, and touch on some key skills. So why give feedback? Well, it's motivational. It helps people do a great job in that you as the manager or the person giving the feedback are reinforcing the things that they're doing well, and you're also helping them improve the things that they need to work on. It also shows recognition. You, the manager, or whoever it is giving the feedback, are showing that you're interested in what that person is doing. The overall outcomes of this are that you improve performance, you improve retention of that person in the organisation, and ultimately you improve the individual confidence, which then sets up a virtuous cycle of improving performance. So, constructive feedback. What is constructive feedback and what makes it constructive? Well, there's a number of elements to that, and what we're going to do, we're going to have a look first of all what makes feedback destructive. Once we can avoid these destructive elements, then that straight away will help make the feedback that we provide more constructive. And just remember that feedback that is constructive is both positive and developmental. So what are these elements that make feedback destructive? Well, if it's subjective, it's your view, and you don't have any evidence to back it up, that can be quite damaging. Delayed feedback given too long after an event has little or no value for a number of reasons. First of all, the individual might not even remember what you're talking about, and that's particularly a challenge if your feedback is developmental. And by developmental, I mean helping people improve what they're doing. If it's infrequent, if you have a system where you have regular feedback, people are more likely to accept it. But if feedback is unusual or infrequent, there can be an element of suspicion as to why have you just started giving feedback. So it's about starting off and starting to make feedback a key part of the way your organisation works. Only focusing on what people need to do differently, and even worse, just focusing on what people have done wrong, is extremely damaging because that can actually reinforce the behaviours or the actions that you don't want to happen, and it's extremely demotivational. Just telling people what they need to do differently, or even just telling people what they've done well, that is far less effective and can be destructive because people don't internalise it, they don't take it on board, and you could just be wasting your time. And of course, frankly, inaccurate feedback is extremely destructive. So what makes feedback constructive? Making it specific with clear examples of where people have either done things well or they need to do something differently. Make it objective. It's not just your view, but it's backed up by evidence of some sort. Timely. Give feedback as close as possible to the event that you can. In that way, you're more likely to have a positive effect. Make feedback a frequent part of what you do. Give both reinforcing and developmental feedback. So reinforcing, keep doing the same stuff. developmental, do things differently. Make sure feedback is two-way, in that it's not just you telling people things, is they are telling you what they think they did well or they need to do differently. And of course, make sure feedback is accurate. So now we come on to the Ask-Give model, a very useful model for providing feedback in a structured way that makes the feedback itself far more effective for both you and the individual. First of all, feedback is taking people from what they know to what they don't know. And as discussed earlier, there are two types of feedback. There's developmental, this is where somebody's not competent at something and they need to do something differently. Or conversely, they are competent and you just need to keep making sure that they keep doing that. So you're reinforcing that behaviour. Now, the first stage is part of the reinforcing. So you ask the individual, what did you do well, or words to that effect? So what this does is this gets the individual to think about the performance from a positive point of view. The next stage is, because they may not give you everything that you're looking for, is you tell them, you give them examples of where they did well. And this is where making examples specific becomes really valuable. The next stage is to look at the developmental side of the feedback. So as per the Ask-Give model, the next stage is we ask them what could they do differently. And notice that phraseology, it's what could you do differently, not what did you do wrong. Because we want to reinforce all the way through actually the positive behaviour that we want. And by asking the individual, we are helping them buy into whatever changes they need to make because they're identifying the challenges, the issues themselves. The final stage of the Ask-Give model is you are giving them examples of where they could do things differently. Because, of course, you may not have got everything you want from the earliest stage. So that's the Ask-Give model. You're asking them what did they do well. You're then giving them anything that they missed. You're asking them what could they do differently and giving them anything they missed. One thing to be aware of with feedback is don't try and deal with too many areas. If you give people a whole list of what they did well and what they need to do differently, they won't remember it. Focus on 2 or 3 key points in any situation. Now, let's just touch very lightly on 2 other key skills that are required with feedback. And these are listening and questioning. Now, the very nature of both questioning and listening skills are very large subjects, and if you want to really develop those skills, actual practice in the workplace or in any environment is what makes you better at it. However, something to think about is if you're clinical, draw on those skills you already use with patients and families. If you're not clinical, draw on those skills you already use with your team, your colleagues, etc. Now, to make sure you're on the right track, there's some really great resources out there on the MindTools website. Just go there, search for listening and questioning skills, and there's lots of resources there, and most of those are free. I'll leave you with one more point, and that is if you're asking good questions, good quality questions, and you're listening and really taking the time to listen to those answers without trying to fill in the blanks yourself, you are the one who's most likely to get the most information out of that discussion, and you're most likely to be in control of it. And also, if people are able to talk themselves, they are more engaged in that whole conversational piece. Just something to think about. So the objectives for this podcast were for you to be able to define what constructive feedback is, and that is feedback that is balanced, both reinforcing and developmental. And the final objective for you to be able to demonstrate feedback skills that result in a positive change in the receiver is something that actually you'll get from practice. The more you do it, the more effective you'll become. And that's either sat down practice in appraisal settings or hot feedback in the ward or whatever environment you're working in. But the key thing here is practice. There are lots of resources available on this subject and many, many others. So if you go to iLearn, have a look at the toolkits pages, or just go into the catalogue search and search for podcasts, you'll find lots of useful information on many of the subjects that we deal with. Also, as I've already shown you, go to the MindTools website, lots and lots of useful resources. And LinkedIn and LinkedIn Pulse often produce very insightful articles from across the globe that you may or may not be able to use. So please take your time and have a look with that. That's it. Thank you for watching this podcast. If you want to find out any more information or you need support in other areas, please contact myself or my colleagues on these email addresses or on extension 8004. Thank you.